Hello, welcome to this session. It's called Benchmark Your Pardot Database Health, and it's a bit of a different session than some of the others will be. So I'm not going to talk at you for 25 minutes. You will actually be getting hands-on with Pardot, and we'll be having a bit of a group experiment in terms of benchmarking your own database metrics. So really, the whole approach here is it's an experiment, it's meant to be fun, and I don't know what's going to happen. So if nobody actually completes this exercise, at least I get a funny anecdote out of it. I'm not going to spend too much time introducing myself. Just really in 10 seconds, I've been using Pardot for about 6 years between different roles as an end user, an agency consultant, a freelancer, and a contractor. And the content in this session is from insights that I've gained from working in around 40 to 50 different Pardot orgs with clients. And I'm going to give examples of where some of the metrics I look for when I'm auditing the health of a Pardot org. So the first thing is really just when we are a Pardot admin, we want to try and make decisions based on real data points in our Pardot org. And the aim of this session is to give you some of those key metrics that assess the health of your org against those of your peers. So we've got a structure to the session. We'll start with some theory. I'll then introduce a hands-on task. You'll enter your own results from the task anonymously into our sheet, and we'll review the results together. And I've got some recommendations based on what you enter into the sheet. First of all, let's start with that theory. And what I wanted to introduce today as a piece of Pardot functionality is something called dynamic lists. I remember when I was starting to use Pardot and learn the system, it probably took me about 6 months to start using them fully. And then it actually took years to see the full capabilities of what you can do with Pardot dynamic lists. So I think of them as a way of, as an admin, allowing you to reduce time and improve accuracy spent when creating dynamic lists. So because you create lists, dynamic lists in Pardot by defining rule-based criteria, you don't have any manual errors in data processing, issues with uploading CSVs, etc. And because you define the criteria for who should be in your list, rather than selecting individual prospects and uploading them, the rules that you set are always going to be running in the background of your Pardot org. So that means that your list actually stays up to date in the future, and it can be used for regular email communications. So a great example of that would be a monthly newsletter that you send every month. Maybe right now you're manually creating that list, manually uploading it. Well, Pardot's dynamic lists actually give a really good solution to automate that process and make sure that your list is there every month, ready for you to use and has the freshest clean data that you have. And then on the more advanced side, you can also use Pardot dynamic lists even in email preference centers. So to allow you to show different preferences to different prospects depending on what data you hold about them in the system. So for example, showing USA specific prospects dynamic lists related to comms that you would only send to American clients. But what I want to also talk about today, and the bonus point, is really that because when you run a dynamic list, you actually see the number of prospects that match your criteria, they're really great for reporting. And we're going to use that in your own mini health check. I want to just show you how to use dynamic lists. So I've got some steps in the slides which you can follow yourselves, but I'll also give you a quick demo. So first of all, we're going to navigate in Pardot to marketing, segmentation, and lists. And then to create a new dynamic list, we simply click on Add List. You'll enter a list name. So let's call this my dynamic list. And you need to check the dynamic list checkbox. So this actually, you'll see, changes the prompt from create list to set the rules. So that's exactly what we'll do. On the next page, this is where we build the rules for our dynamic list. The first thing that you see at the top is something called a match type. Now, a match type allows us to specify if we have more than one criteria as part of our list, how should the criteria be evaluated? So if you imagine I have 3 different criteria for my list, if I have match all selected, then it means that somebody in our database, a prospect, must match all of the criteria that I set to become a member of this list. However, if I select match any, that means that a prospect must meet at least one of the criteria that I define. A good example of this might be that I can click add new rule and then set some criteria. In this example, let's set a criteria against a prospect default field, and I'm going to set this to country is United Kingdom, for example. And I'm also going to create a new rule by clicking the add new rule button. And this time, let's use a bit more advanced piece of functionality, and we'll use something called a new rule group. A new rule group allows you to mix different types of match types within one dynamic list. So it's a bit like putting brackets around part of a maths equation. What I can do here is say, even though my overall match type for my list is match all, in a particular part of this dynamic list, I want to use a match any criteria. And this might say, let's also go to prospect default field, and we will pick job title. And I'm going to say job title contains manager. And I'm going to add a new rule here for prospect default field. Job title contains officer, for example. So what this essentially says is that somebody to become part of this list must be in the United Kingdom, and they must either have a title which contains manager or contains officer. And then all we need to do is we get the option to preview our dynamic list, which will tell us how many prospects in the database this will match, or we can run the rules, and that will just, if I click OK, take us to the next screen where we're going to see that this matches 0 prospects. So don't worry at this stage. What happens now is that Pardot goes away and evaluates the criteria that we set against what we hold in our database. And that can take a good few minutes, but you will receive an email from Pardot when that is ready for you to check. So it's going to tell you in that email that your dynamic list has been evaluated. It will tell you how many people match it, and you can click into Pardot and have a look at which prospects that matches. So you're always going to see 0 straight away. Just jumping back to the task that we have then. Using what you've just seen, we've got a small task for you. So I'm going to share this link again directly in the chat. So just bear with me. So I've just posted that link again. So this is a link to a Google form. And the Google form, if I just open it up, guides you through some audit checks that you can do on your own Pardot.org whilst you're in this call. And the first thing you're going to see, I'll just give a quick talk before letting you do it yourselves. But the first thing you're going to see is something I've called my unique identifier. This is just a reference point so that you can see in the results which was your particular answers. Now, don't enter your name in here, don't enter your company name, don't want any personally identifiable information. So I've just recommended that you could add in your favorite color and favorite animal, for example, crimson reindeer, indigo panda, turquoise mongoose. So if you put your name, I'm just going to kind of delete it out of the results database, which we'll have a look at in a second. But overall, once you've done that piece, then you can move down, and then there's some questions that you can answer based on your own Pardot.org. And again, I don't want to collect individual identification of orgs. But those 2 questions around the number of prospects in your org, the number of available prospects in your org, these are really important for us to get a percentage basis. There's some calculations. So for example, out of the total number of prospects, the number of prospects who've been mailed, for example. So I recommend doing the first two questions last, in fact, but starting at this dynamic list here called number of mailable prospects who have been emailed. And you can actually see a screenshot directly. Oh, somebody's asking for the link again. There you go. You can see in here the exact rules that you need to set in your dynamic list. So right at the top here, I've provided a link to the slides. If you wanted to kind of go through those slides 8 and 9 again, and that guides you to where you find dynamic lists in Pardot and how you set them up. And then you can just enter all the criteria that you see here and then click Run Rules. So just moving down them, there's actually 3 different dynamic lists set up. And then whilst those are calculating in your Pardot.org and whilst you're waiting to receive the email, you can do the first 2 points, which are the number of prospects and number of total mailable prospects. So I'm going to let you start with that. Just post in the chat if you have any issues, any questions, and I'm going to help. I'm going to give you a few minutes to start getting going on it, and then we can start to have a look at how the results are outputted and what sort of findings you can get from this. So any issues in the chat? No, don't see any. Whilst you're completing those, just looking at the dynamic lists that are in here, just to explain kind of why I picked some of these. So the first one, which is number of mailable prospects who have been emailed. What we're trying to get a feel for here is out of your database, what proportion of your database are you actively sending email communications to? So it's a really good benchmark point to understand if you have lots of people in your database who you aren't actually emailing. So there could be several reasons for this. Maybe first of all, there is a legitimate reason for you to collect Pardot prospect records and not send emails to them. So perhaps you're using some kind of SMS integration and communicating with SMS. Perhaps you're actually missing key segmentation variables, which means that you've got people in your database, but you don't actually have the right piece of information about them to send emails to them. I can see a couple of questions coming through. So we've got a question from Tim. Can Pardot build dynamic lists from more complex booleans, e.g. condition 1 or condition 2 and condition 3? So the answer is in fact yes. If we look back at my example earlier, this is exactly what you need to do. So this is the functionality called new rule groups. So that's allowing you to set different match types within your overall dynamic list. So I could easily here as well have an overall match type of match any, but in my my sub criteria, I could have match all. Looking at the other questions as well. Can you mix and or in the same dynamic rule, or do you have to do them as separate queries? So yeah, that's also answered here. So you can have a mixture within one dynamic list of match all and match any criteria using that rule group functionality. And we've got another question from Shivani. Should we include dynamic lists that will be public lists in email preference page? So not exactly sure what the question is there, but if you want to see in your own org which dynamic lists are used in email preference pages, if you navigate to the list of lists, there is a column in here which states public. And a public list in Pardot is simply a list which is used on a preference page. So that's how you can actually see. You can just actually click public, and I've got none in my test org here, but that would sort them, and you would see at the top the dynamic lists which are used in a email preference page. Okay, so just looking at timing. Do we have any submissions? Not just yet, but I see a few of you are currently in there right now. So this isn't going to close off after the session finishes. This is going to still be there. Just a couple of things to point out on the audit tab. What you'll see once you start to enter your details into the Google form is that they'll automatically come onto the audit page. And in the audit page, I've set up some conditional formatting, which is going to show you how your stats compare to others. So you're going to see green highlights to your stats when you're at the top end, so in the top third of performance, and you're going to see red stats when you're in the lower end of performance. So for example, if you send emails to a lower percentage of your database than your peers, it's going to show up in red. And again, that's not necessarily a negative, it's just that your org is slightly different. So this is all just a fun benchmarking idea. If I navigate back over to the sheet, so yeah, here's the guide for anybody watching this after the session as a recording. And what you'll do is once you've submitted the form, you can then click on to the results page, which is a Google Sheet, and you can navigate into the stats tab, which gives the overall average of all the submissions, and the data tab shows yours as an individual line, which is comparable. So a few more questions. So Isabel says the lists are still rendering. Yes, it's probably going to take at least 5 or 10 minutes, I imagine. So just complete the Google form when that's done. It's certainly a very ambitious scope for a 25-minute session, so I'm quite conscious that most people might run over, but that's fine. A couple more questions. Are there plans to enable A/B testing with dynamic lists? Currently, when you split a dynamic list, it becomes static. Yes, you're right. When you split a dynamic list, it does become static. I'm not aware of any plans in the roadmap to change that behavior. Also, Tim says he's misunderstood the exercise. You're not up and running yet, so can't complete. No problem. These materials will be available afterwards, and the recording will be there for 30 days, I believe. Data tab does not appear to be updating, says Mike. So let's just have a quick check. Great. So yeah, there's a bit of formula issue there. As does happen when you test this, it works perfectly, and then when you come to do the actual exercise, there we go, that's better. So that's starting to update. We're getting a few submissions through. So yeah, you can see the conditional formatting in here. So higher levels of performance are green, lower levels of performance are red, and around in the middle 33% is white for these. Just to jump back to the slides now that a few of you have started to submit. So there's a few questions and answers that I can foresee here. So first question is, my org seems very different than others. Are we making mistakes? Are we doing something wrong? The answer is absolutely not, because every sales and marketing process is different. Every part of org is different. As I mentioned earlier, there might be orgs where you're not sending emails to every prospect, and that makes sense for your process. There might be other orgs where you send an autoresponder email straight after a form submission, which means that everybody in your org is has been emailed before. So there's no right and wrong answers here. It's really a fun benchmarking exercise to really understand how your org compares to others. If you do have any concerns based on the stats and you think that you've got a particular outlier for one of the metrics, then I do recommend visiting the Pardot community. So I put a link in the slides, which you'll get after the session. If any of you haven't used it, that's a really great place for you to be able to post questions and answers and receive answers from other members of the community. And then what I've done as well is I've put a Q&A for each of the 3 dynamic lists that you've made. And if you're concerned about specifically any of those metrics, there's some points for you to consider. So for example, my percentage of mailable prospects is low. What can I do? What I'm saying here is that's not necessarily a bad thing, because unmailable prospects in your Pardot database don't count towards your database limit. So there's some helpful guides to what you might consider doing if you've got a really low mailable percentage. So there's a really good Pardot database cleaning guide that's available there, and there's a link that answers a couple of questions that have had around cleaning the data. And I also recommend looking into a relatively new piece of functionality called Prospect Resubscribe. So that allows you to set things up so that when somebody submits a form and they are currently opted out, they have the option to resubscribe. So if you've got a high percentage of your database which is unmailable because they've maybe unsubscribed or they might have bounced, what you can do is enable that prospect resubscribe, and that can enable you to increase your mailable database percentage. And then consider cleansing any bounced emails. So people might have left the company, there might be an invalid syntax in the email, for example. So we've also got Q&As for the other 2 pieces as well. Let me just check on timing. So we're actually getting very close to the end of the session. Let's just check this. Oh, we need some more drag downs on the data. Oh, we've had some really good submissions. So definitely hasn't been the case that we've got no submissions. We've managed to get nearly 30 in this time. What I'll do is I'll check this after the session. I can see some obvious issues, like somebody's got the wrong numbers here. But hopefully that's a really useful exercise, and you can see your own stats directly within here. It seems like everybody's followed the instructions correctly anyway. And then there's just one more slide because I'm running out of time here. So there's a few more points. Definitely join this ParDreamin 2020 product roadmap keynote tomorrow. So that's at 10 AM EST on the main stage. There's also a Dream TX session, which is recommended at 11:30 PST on December 14th. And there's a link to that in here as well. Great, I'm going to pop back to the Q&A, just check if there's any more questions, but hopefully you all found that quite useful. Okay, there's an absolute swamp of questions which I can't get to them all. Let me just pick a couple of relevant ones. Jessica asks, can you provide documentation on the prospect resubscribe? I don't have that to hand. Your best bet is actually just to Google Pardot prospect resubscribe, and it will be the Salesforce knowledge base that pops up as probably the first result in there. Carmen asks, when I check on prospects and run the mailable prospects view, I receive a number, but then from the dynamic list, the mailable number is considerably lower. Why is that? Why is that different? So none of the lists that we just looked at ask you to generate the same thing. So what I'd assume, and this is probably going to be the last question, if I navigate into the Google Sheet and look at the form, so I think you're meaning that these numbers are different. So the reason for that is that this is total days who can receive an email, i.e. they are what Pardot calls mailable. So that means they are not unsubscribed, they are not hard bounced. Do not email. This dynamic list, which is the one that I think you're saying has a different number to this one is telling us who out of these prospects who are mailable has actually received an email in the past from Pardot. So this is saying out of everybody who we can email, what proportion of them have we emailed? So it's a really good way of seeing, are we using our database to its full potential? Okay, so I'm actually well over time now, so I do have to end the session, but thank you all for joining.